All right, a very good morning to you. How are we doing this Thursday morning? I hope that you're well. As always, thank you very much for joining us. This is Your World, and my name is Winnie Lubem. And of course, today, even as we prepare in less than 48 hours, actually 48 hours, of course, the world will be meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, that is in Egypt, for COP27. And of course, there's a lot when it comes to climate change. There has been a lot of conversation surrounding the same. And of course, we just want to understand, so where exactly are we as far as some of the commitments that were made, especially from COP26? There's a lot that we're going to discuss in this 1 hour, so make sure that you stay tuned until the end of the conversation, because again, like we all know, the world is already experiencing changes in average temperature, shifts in the seasons, and of course an increasing frequency. And this is in terms of what we're experiencing now in terms of the weather, the erratic weather. Sometimes it's hot, sometimes it's cold, sometimes there are floods, going around all over the place. And of course, the question is, what exactly is happening to our world, and what is our contribution, our individual contribution towards the same? And the question is, what can we do to reverse the harsh effects of climate change? So there's a lot that we're going to discuss in this 1 hour. And of course, the question that we're asking you today is, how are you contributing towards climate change action, either positively or negatively? All right, what exactly is your individual contribution? Because most of the time we usually quick to blame others, blame the government, blame I don't know who else, who is not doing what they're supposed to do. But what exactly is your individual contribution towards the same? You know the deal by now. Interact with us on our social media handles at NTV Kenya, both on Facebook and on Twitter. I'll be looking at your feedback, and remember to tag me as well at Lubembe_Winnie. The hashtag to use is Your World. All right. And of course, you want to call in live and also chime in towards the conversation, feel free to do so. The numbers are down on your screen. But let me introduce my guest in studio. I have Maimuna Kabatesi. I was about to call you someone else. Maimuna Kabatesi, who's a global program manager, Voices for Just Climate Action. So good to see you this morning. How are you doing?
Thank you, Winnie. I'm good, thank you. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you. And first of all, just thank you for coming, to just have this very important conversation that we should all be talking about every single day, not just now when we're preparing for COP27. And of course, joining us as well is Dr. Nancy Omola, who's a gender and climate change expert. And of course, she's joining us all the way from Egypt. Good morning, Dr. Nancy. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Good, good, thanks. How's the weather? I'm just going to ask. Because we're 1 hour...
I was told that the weather is warm here in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Sharm el-Sheikh, yes.
So, and we're really looking forward to the day.
Oh.
We're just 1 hour behind Kenya, but everything is fine.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Nancy, again, for making time for us, really, despite the crazy schedule, because I can imagine right now everything is just everywhere, because, again, we're preparing for COP, which should be happening in 48 hours. But before we even talk about the promises and what happened at COP26 and some of the, commitments that were made, very quickly, let's just talk about... climate change. I'm just going to start with you, Maimuna, because majority of the times when we talk about climate change, what we see is we separate ourselves. And it's sort of like natural and normal to separate ourselves from what is happening, because we don't see, maybe just one person, what is it that I'm doing to contribute towards climate change? But of course, that impacts us one way or the other. Some people might maybe more as compared to the others. But really, when we talk about climate change and the impact that it has, could you just make it clear for us so that we establish base?
Yes, thank you, Winnie. And I think you captured it very well. A lot of times we tend to remove ourselves or assume this is something scientific, and we don't think of climate change as something real. But I think when we look at the world and what's happening today, even for us in Nairobi, let alone some of the areas that are most affected in Kenya, such as the ASAL areas, Marsabit and northern Kenya, climate change is just basically what's happening with the changes that are happening in long-term weather patterns. So, for instance, when you go to, let's say, Eastern Kenya, you talk to a farmer in Kitui, and you ask them, how have things changed over the past 10, 20, 30 years, they'll be able to tell you, a few years ago, a few decades ago, we could predict the seasons very well. You know, we have, our farmers in our communities have ways of telling how these things would happen. They have traditional knowledge. That knowledge is no longer serving them because now everything is out of work.
Yeah.
Even for us in Nairobi, you know, we are seeing people saying it's not raining when it's supposed to, the cold seasons are colder.
I mean, just the other day it was hot.
Exactly.
And
2
now,
days ago. And
right?
now it's raining, it's pouring
all over
down.
the place,
And it's very unpredictable right now. So this is actually what we mean when we talk about climate change. And of course, as I said, this is something that is affecting everybody. But some people are more vulnerable than others just because of maybe the area you live in or your status in life. Children are more vulnerable. Women can be more vulnerable. So yes, just to sum up, climate change is something that's happening. It's something that we're all experiencing, and I think it is also something that we need to be talking, as you said, about every day.
Every single day. And action.
And action.
The action part is what is needed.
It's most
all
important.
right. And of course, before we talk to Dr. Nancy, let's take a look at some of the areas that we'll be focusing on, especially when it comes to this year's COP, that is COP27, which again will be happening in Sharm el-Sheikh. And some of the main areas that we'll be looking at includes, number one, reducing emissions, helping countries to prepare and deal with climate change, as well as securing technical support and funding for developing countries. So those are the three main areas that, again, will be of focus. But again, there are some areas that were not fully resolved. That is from COP26. Let's take a look at some of those areas that were not fully covered, but of course will be picked up from COP27, if we can have the graphics. And of course, one of the areas is the loss and damage finance, where we've seen majority of the not African nations per se, but developing nations, if we could say that, you know, who are actually demanding that, you know, the developed nations take care of the damage that has been experienced so far, because again, developing nations only contribute very little as far as emissions are concerned. So what is to be catered, to be covered as far as the loss and damage finance is that money to help countries recover from the effects of climate change rather than just prepare for it. And then also establishment of a global carbon market where the price, again, to price the effects of emissions into products and services globally. Again, we're talking about coal. There's, you know, the whole debate around coal as well. And also to strengthen the commitment to reduce coal use. Again, what we talked about earlier on. And speaking of coal, there's a bit of a discussion around the same because, you know, they were talking about the fact that it was more of the commitment was to, you know, face down and not face out. Exactly. So there's a lot of conversations around that in terms of this is not practical, right? I mean, can we just focus on that a little bit and then we'll come back to get to understand what
Yes, thank you so much. And actually, just to share, I was in Glasgow last year, and to be honest, it was one of the things I was most disappointed about. I actually feel like when you talk about climate change or we should actually be using terminology that actually shows how urgent this situation is. So we're in a climate emergency, we're in a climate crisis, and yet we still have countries, developed countries, who are not willing to make actions that show the commitment to actually starting to reverse these effects or to make sure that they don't go, like for instance, the temperature increase is not as high as it could be. So you have countries that their energy systems and their economies are reliant on producing energy from coal. And so instead of committing to phase out, because of course it's a legal commitment, what they're saying is, no, we're going to reduce slowly. But these countries are already such high emitters that it creates a really big knock-on effect if somebody's not willing to say, we're going to actually take steps and put a year at which we will stop using coal completely. So phase down is kind of weak language in my point of view. I think it's language that, you know, at the same time, you have these countries urging, for instance, African countries to not explore coal, to not explore fossil fuels, but they're not willing to make that same commitment that they're urging us to do.
There's a bit of a double standard.
Exactly. It's a very, very extreme double standard. But because we're having this crisis, and we've seen over the past year, climate change doesn't just impact us. We are more vulnerable because of a lot of reasons, because climate change is a crisis of inequality. But last year we saw during summer there were floods in Germany, which is of course also a high coal consumer. So climate change is not going to discriminate, to be honest. It's going to affect all of us. So it's very urgent.
And even this year, I think Europe dealt with the worst heat wave, you know, ever. So, right? So what you're saying, I mean, it's not just us, you know, as, you know, developing nations that we're feeling the pinch. huge.
Yeah.
It's just that we don't contribute much,
We
but
don't,
yet
yes, exactly.
we're the ones who are affected
Exactly, yeah.
mostly. All right, and Dr. Nancy, again, of course, the Kenyan delegation is in Egypt. Some will actually be traveling today, others tomorrow, you know, and so on and so forth. But one might ask, so then, really, what is that contribution, like Kenya's contribution towards climate change, and of course, you know, what will be happening as far as COP27 is concerned?
All right. Thank you so much, Winnie. So Kenya delegation is here in Sharm el Sheikh.
Yes.
The name is a bit, we just call it Sharm. Here we just call it, we are here at Sharm.
Okay.
And I went yesterday, and yesterday we had a meeting with the Kenyan delegation, including the new CS, Rosalinda Saipan-Tuja. She's already here. Over the weekend, 7th and 8th, we're expecting President Ruto and the team to arrive. And Kenya has been attending all these COPs over the years because we realize that climate change is a global issue. So for us to tackle climate change, we all need together. And that's why the UNFCCF, United Nations Framework on Climate Change, decided to have a yearly meeting and discuss the climate change issues. And one of the things I'm happy about that, you know, it's getting the coverage globally, it's getting the coverage at the local level, in national level in Kenya. And now you ask a CBC student at CBC year 4, year 6 about climate change, and they know about it. So basically here when we come, we're going to discuss many things. We're going to discuss gender and climate change. We're going to look at adaptation. We're going to look at climate change and financing. So there are various thematic areas that we're going to cover. And for me, I'll be leading the Kenyan delegation on the negotiating on gender and climate change. So some of the issues that I think are going to be very important is that, you know, why gender and climate change? Yeah. And we talk about women being vulnerable, women, youth, the marginalized and the indigenous community. But where is the money to fund all these processes?
And I like the fact that you brought up, you know, the whole aspect about gender, and you also did the same, Maimuna, because majority of the time when we talk about, you know, all these aspects and see how women and girls, you know, youth and persons living with disabilities as well, you know, get affected by this, and people usually be like, but men are affected too. So why are we mostly focusing on women? So could we just point that out very quickly, Dr. Nancy, and then we'll come back, you know, to address some of these commitments, and of course we also talked up to, and especially when it comes to adaptation, mitigation, it's a lot sometimes to really understand all those things.
All right. Yes, I like the fact that, Winnie, you're asking that, you know, are men not vulnerable? One of the questions when I go to Turkana, and I went with this perception that women are vulnerable, they told me that, no, here, every one of us is vulnerable. Depending that you're vulnerable, what age are you? If you're 80-year-old woman, you're 80-year-old man, you're all vulnerable. And you're also vulnerable if you're maybe 80-year-old and you have disability. And some of other issues which you also consider is the socioeconomic status. Because of your socioeconomic status, you can be vulnerable. So vulnerability, if you're a woman who's lactating. So we talk about women and men because we realize that climate change does not have, it impacts women and men differently. And this is because they have different gender roles. For example, if you go to the rural areas, women are in charge of collecting firewood, they're in charge of collecting water. So with the changing climate whereby we have drought, that means that women have to walk a longer distance to fetch water. They have to walk a longer distance to look for firewood. And due to climate change, when you look at all this marginalized community, you find that the gender roles are changing. Now, for instance, sometimes men have to look for firewood because if there's no firewood and women have to walk longer, then, you know, they risk, you know, being attacked because of the conflict issue. So sometimes men to go to fetch this, but when we look at that, when men start fetching firewood, then they go and cut the wood in, you know, they go for it in a mass quantity and they sell it. So you even look at, you know, when the gender role changes, sometimes you can say that, oh, when now men can look for firewood, then it's good. Women have got less work. But when women go to fetch firewood, they just take the dry wood and all that for the family. But when men go for it, you see them cutting down the forest. So we cannot talk about climate change without looking at the intersectionality, whereby you're saying that you're not just vulnerable because of you're a woman, you're just vulnerable because of your socioeconomic status, You're vulnerable because you are disabled. You are differently abled, people living with disability. You're vulnerable because of your geographical location. Maybe you're based in Samburu, you're based in Baringo or somewhere else like that. And also when you look at your education status, because if you're a woman and you're educated, you're more likely maybe to get kind of employment. So that's why it really is important. And also when you look generally, women form the majority of the poor. And the poor are going to be much more affected with the climate change. So as much as we're talking about climate change here in Sharm at the international level, and that we are also having that discussion at national level in Kenya and in other countries, what we're asking that, what actions can we have at the local level? And one of the, apart from us negotiating here, we're already getting some multilateral money to deal with climate change. And for example, the National Treasury has received almost 17 billion or Kenya shillings to deal with the climate action. They have the FLOCA program, financing locally led climate at the action level. And this is going to work with the 47 counties. And we're going to give grants to these counties. But one of the things that I'm looking for as the gender expert who's advising on that program is that when this money goes to the counties, and we're not just going to give money to the counties, we're going to give the counties because they've met certain criteria. Maybe they have climate change bill in place. And one thing that I'm asking is that, can we have 30% of these grants going to the countries ring-fenced so that it's going to support the women, the youth, and marginalized. And we have, for example, 30% ring-fenced. Then we can create indicators and we can follow up that is this money really leading to transformation at the local level.
Absolutely. And of course, we need to keep someone accountable. And speaking of keeping someone accountable, of course, the question is, and especially when it comes to the developed nations, the commitments were made. They're not legally binding as per se, Someone was saying it was more of, like country levels of like policy, because you made a commitment, you have to, but it's not legally binding. So the question is then, how do we hold them accountable? Because 100 billion, every year, that's a commitment that was made many years ago, but still that has not been achieved. So let's take a break, Maimuna, but of course when we come back, we'd also want to pick up from there, even as we look at then our own contribution as a country, right? And as individuals as well, as far as climate change action is concerned. So much to discuss, but remember the question that we're asking you, that is, what is your individual contribution towards climate change action? I'll be looking at your feedback after the break. Stay with us. This is Your World.
Now, as much as watu hawana pesa wamedharau hizo shati za umse, what you're missing is, ni hii shati ukivaa poa, mtu hawezi kosa kukupea compliment. Buda mazi, hiyo shati ni moto.
Like just because nimekusmailia, haimaanishi na kudai.
Mbona usound blended in the first place?
Because I'm a friendly person. Mimi niko friendly bena. Sasa nimekama hapa hivi nimekuhug.
Na wewe unathink nilikuwa nakungotea ndo tukue blend? Tunajua ngeni yangu na.
In your paper this week, General Muhoozi continues to show defiance. No serving army officer has enjoyed the latitude of opinion and freedom without any sanction, as President Museveni's son has. Ruto's rich ministers to push pro-poor policies, plus our opinion leaders. Let's take a hard look at the breeds and maybe learn a thing or two. Generali Ulimwengu. Are East African community leaders interested in having Uganda crude oil refined here? Joachim Buembo. Presidency is like booze. Stay too long, you won't ever want to leave. Charles Onyango Obo. Magazine. Status and power. Royal women show how to protect Zulu King. For this and more stories, get your copy of the East African.
Weeks after a new directive by Kenya's President William Ruto reverted all imported sea cargo clearing services back to this port city of Mombasa, shipping lines are now busy filling in new orders to lease or sell containers as demand rises. I'm here to find out what this means for the country's economy.
I'm driving down a busy Johannesburg road, and we're currently at stage 6 of the load shedding. And as you can see, it's quite dark. The traffic lights aren't operational, and basically all the light that we're seeing right now is coming from other cars. And it's quite a sad indictment of the current state that South Africa currently faces as a result of this consistent and persistent power cuts.
New Sensodyne Repair and Protect with Deep Repair. It's a huge game changer for me. The science is pretty amazing because it really goes deep inside the tooth and repairs tooth sensitivity. It's going to improve the quality of my life in a big way.
Welcome back. Glad you're still with us. Of course, the show is Your World, and today it's all about the road to COP27, and we're analyzing the commitments versus the deliverables, all right? And of course, some of the expectations that we have as far as COP27 is concerned. What conversation, again, are we looking forward to have post COP27? But we're asking you, what is your individual contribution towards climate change action, all right? What is your individual contribution? What exactly are you doing? Because it's easy for us to blame the government, blame the international communities, blame your neighbor or your child or your family member. But really, what is your individual contribution towards climate change action? Of course, interact with us on our socials. That is on Twitter and on Facebook. That is at NTV Kenya. Tag me as well on Lubembe_Winnie. The hashtag to use is Your World. But if you want to call me live and ask, my guest, either Maimuna or Dr. Nancy, any question as far as climate change is concerned, again, you are allowed to do so. The numbers are down on your screen. And of course, Maimuna, very quickly, in terms of what we're seeing right now, right? All the changes, all these experiences, we clearly can see them, but majority of the time, like we said when we started the show, we tend to separate ourselves, from what is happening. Yeah. And one might ask, so fine, COP26, there was a lot of commitments that were made, and we saw a number of them. But the question is then keeping track. Where are we? What are some of the things that have been delivered? What is it that we're lacking? And, what has been the biggest challenge?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think if we look back at Glasgow, COP26, but also looking beyond, of course, at Glasgow, there was a lot of discussion about the $100 billion per year commitment for climate change action. That was a legally binding commitment made during the time of the Paris Agreement. Yeah. And in Glasgow, actually, the stocktake, we realized that this commitment has not been upheld. I think the latest figure found that the financing had reached about $79 billion per year. This sounds like a lot of money, but compared to the amount of money that especially climate vulnerable countries need, it's nowhere near enough. In Glasgow, the again, non-legally binding commitment that was made was that, the countries that are supplying the financing said, well, we are deeply disappointed. We did not achieve this financing, and we are going to start taking action to achieve this financing. So we are still looking at another 3 years before we actually reach that commitment made in 2015, right? So we are already actually lagging behind. The other thing was that there were other commitments that came out at Glasgow related to, for instance, we already talked about the phasing down of coal, phasing out of financing for fossil fuels at the international level, which still means a lot of these countries could still be financing fossil fuels internally, and that's where the emissions are coming from. There were commitments about deforestation and land degradation, or the halting of land degradation. I think for me, ultimately, there were a lot of commitments, but for me, the commitments did not go far enough, and these ones made at Glasgow were not legally binding. So a lot of times, especially the developed countries, do not want to commit in a legally binding manner. And what that means is that there isn't any reassurance for climate vulnerable countries, for instance, small island developing states who are literally at risk of disappearing because of rising sea levels. So ultimately, the discussions in this COP and of course continuing should be how can we get to a space where we are having commitments made and followed through. You might sometimes see one or two countries saying, well, we will do this, but as a global community, I think as Dr. Nancy said, this is not something that we can address as individual countries, because what somebody does in Japan is going to affect somebody in northern Kenya. What somebody does in the USA is going to affect somebody in like Lesotho.
It's a chain,
so we have to be in this together, and we have to get to a point where we are committing in terms of our commitments, legally binding in terms of the policies that we make. We have nationally determined contributions, which every country in the world has to talk about how they're going to reduce their emissions. But those are also not legally binding.
That's the thing.
How do we get to a space where every single country
accountable?
is... And then in that way, we are able to hold each other accountable as countries, as the international community. It also helps as I'm a member of civil society. So civil society citizens, you know, how can we hold, and you talked about governments, how can we hold not only our governments accountable, but other governments? How do we hold the financiers accountable? If somebody says, well, I'm going to stop funding fossil fuels in 2030, but in 2035 they're still doing it. What recourse, there's somebody affected by this in, let's say, Kibera in Kenya who's affected by floods. What recourse would they have? None, if it's not legally binding.
That's true.
Yes,
that's true. And of course, this then poses a very big challenge. You know, as far as you know, combating climate change.
Absolutely.
And also, Dr. Nancy, what might so fine. Again, the question about we as a continent, that is Africa as a continent, which is bearing the brunt of the same, but generally when we talk about developing nations, one might ask, so then what can we do? What is our role, you know, in ensuring, fine, yes, we expect you to pay for the damage, which again, we'll be having that conversation later on, but also us, you know, as developing nations, what is our contribution? What is our role towards the same? So that we're not just sitting here and waiting for others to actually pay for, you know, for some of those things.
Yeah, thank you, Winnie. I think Maimuna has really summarized it about, you know, the commitment made, but, you know, after committing maybe 100 billion per year, then we don't see it being implemented. We don't see the money coming, or even the money coming, we still have very complex processes of accessing those money. But I think during this COP, there are much other discussions which goes beyond money. As money is important, there are other things. For example, we're looking at the policies that we are having. Like, of course, Kenya have Climate Change Act 2016. And, you know, when you look at this Climate Change 2016, you know, it was a process. There was a lot of dialogues for us to come up with this Climate Change Act for 2016. And, for example, when I look at the issues of gender, they're mainstreamed in this document. And, yes, they're mainstreamed. When you look at documents like National Climate Change Action Plan 2018 to 2022, and now we are developing another one, 2023, for the next 5 years. And you find that gender has been mainstreamed in this document. And also you look at different ministries. You go to different Ministry of Environment. We have a climate change desk. We have gender focal points. You go to even other institutions like the Council of Governors. We have a climate change, department there. Are gender issues being mainstreamed? And you find they are. But the position we find ourselves in that even if we have these climate change issues, or we have gender being mainstreamed in this document, there's a gap between what is appearing in the document and what is being implemented. Even, for example, when you look at the Kenya Constitution 2010, it says that we need the 2/3 gender representation. And that's very important because this will give, the women and the youth a chance to kind of participate at decision-making level. But you have it so nicely there in the Kenyan Constitution, but it's never been implemented. It's never been passed in the parliament. So we're having a gap on, you know, what has been stated even at the national level, at the policy level, and implementing them at the local level. So that is kind of like a gap. But I think we've really tried by having these policies in place, and Kenya is leading in this kind of processes. And also, when we talk about moving to green energy, I think Kenya has really so much to invest in the green energy through the geothermal and all that. But one of the challenges we have even at this level, when we talk about green energy and, green energy, and maybe we look at gender issues and green energy, we're talking about big projects, but we're not looking at about the energy being used at the local level. Because if you look at this country, 60% of the population still use fossil fuel, using firewood. Yes, we only have a forest cover of 10%. So how can we promote, for example, mitigation through using improved clean vehicles, through using solar lighting, and even just promoting 10%, more than 10% of, yeah, so those are some of the things you can do at the national level.
Absolutely. And then, of course, one might ask, so the fact that, because this is the 5th COP, right, that is being held in Africa, one might ask, so the fact that we have it, in Sharm el-Sheikh, what significance does that have? What message are we, sort of like passing, and especially when it comes to the international communities?
I think it's really important when you have it in Africa. We have it in Sharm. Yesterday I arrived in Cairo and I could not get a local flight, and basically I took a bus from Cairo to Sharm. And you can see that Egypt basically is a desert. This is a desert region, but just being a desert does not mean that they're kind of vulnerable. If you have the resources, people can still get water and you can still have some kind of investment. So I think Africa is one of the continents which is very vulnerable to climate change, because we have less resilience, we have less resources to deal with this kind of issues. And we had already a climate change conference in Durban. We had a climate change conference in Nairobi, Kenya, and maybe many cannot remember. Now we also have this one here in Sharm, and we also had one in 2016 in Morocco, and I think one was also held somewhere. So even this kind of conference has come to Africa. But the thing is, it's saying that Africa is one of the most vulnerable continents, having less resources. Africa is one of the very youthful kind of continent, and climate change is also affecting the youth, because the youth are unemployed, and also they form part of the big majority. So I think it's really important that we're having it in Africa, a place which is affected by climate change, a country which is also mostly a desert like Egypt. So I think when we're going to talk about those issues, we can be talking and giving kind of personal experiences. So I think it's a very important message, and I think it's time for us to really take up this and take the opportunity to really express what we need as Africans. Yesterday we had the Africa group of negotiators. It started on the 1st and the 2nd, and today we are moving into having a discussion with the G77 and the China. And I think when we go into these discussions and we go into specific groups, either on climate financing, on adaptation, then we're really going to really be putting our issues on the table, and also looking like, as Africans, what can we take from here? There's so many things going on. There are people bringing case studies of what they're doing. I traveled with some people who had come from Liberia, Guinea, DRC Congo, and they're telling me, for example, in Congo, how the youth are working on recycling. So apart from focusing on the big discussions, we're also having people showcasing, what are some of the interesting things they're doing at the local level, and how can we take back from what we see here, how can we bring it back home? Create networks within this kind of workshop. So there's a lot of things which are going on.
I hear you. And of course, like we said earlier on, this takes, it's a collective effort. It's not just, maybe the international community or just governments, civil society, and governmental organizations. It's a collective effort. But of course, Maimuna, then the question might be, so fine, understanding all those commitments, understanding the gaps that are there and what needs to be done. What are some of the successes? I mean, since COP26, because there has been so many COPs. Let's just start with 26. What are some of the things, that you've said, that you have probably seen or picked that, shows that at least we're making progress. We're not there yet, but we're making progress.
Thank you. I think, to be honest, COP26 was not that long ago, and when you track something year on year, it's difficult to be very specific about some of the successes. But one thing I can touch on is something that Dr. Nancy had actually mentioned, the fact that I think COP26 was the first COP that really was picked up by the mainstream media, internationally, but also in Kenya. And we really saw a lot of attention. And, media is really one of the ways we can really reach and empower citizens to have knowledge about, for instance, some of these case studies. Somebody might watch something and get inspired, because if we are talking about adaptation, it's local communities that are going to solve their own problems. Nobody is going to come from outside and
provide a solution
yes,
or
exactly.
tailor-make a solution.
But if local communities are able to see what other local communities are doing and learn from that, and media is such a powerful way to reach, inspire citizens, even just to give citizens that knowledge that yes, what is happening, it's not just us, it's something that's happening, there is a cause for it. And for me, it's also about how do we get citizens, as much as we're talking about locally led adaptation solutions, how do we also get citizens to create a movement, to demand for their rights. And for me, I think that was one of the biggest successes of COP26, that it really got climate change on everybody's agenda, on everybody's radar, you know. Now we see people talking about climate on a day-to-day basis in a way we didn't before. I think apart from that, one of the other things, we did see some great advances at COP26. For instance, the adaptation conversation. Historically, most of the funding has been going to mitigation. And yes, again, what that means, is that local communities who are having climate impacts right now were not getting the financing, the resources. It's not just about financing, by the way. It's also about research. It's also about capacity development. They were not getting the resources needed in order to adapt to the situation. So if a farmer has always planted certain seeds at a certain time, and that changes, but the farmer does not get information on how the change would go. We have a very able, like for instance, meteorological weather department, but if that's not being communicated to the farmer, they don't know how to adjust. If there's improved seeds or improved ways of planting, that information has to be shared. So I think the fact that there is also more of a drive to see more funding go to adaptation, a lot of huge climate financiers are also saying, like, from now on, we're making sure that our climate financing will be 50-50. It also is a commitment that's been made. I think for me, that's also one of the biggest successes, because it means that we will see more money going where it's needed, to the local communities, to those vulnerable people. And Dr. Nancy had already talked about people are differently vulnerable, and I think adaptation financing will also be able to recognize and address those differences.
But the question is then, how do we make sure that the money gets to those people? Because that has always been an issue.
And that has, you're right, that's always been a critical issue. And I think it's something that when we talk about climate change and climate finance, that we are not just talking about the amount of money, as important as that is. It's also about the quality of the financing. So is this financing a loan or a grant? You'd be surprised a lot of times when people are talking about, we've supplied this much in financing. It's loans.
It's loans. We don't need more loans, because
we don't need more loans, but we are climate vulnerable countries being asked to take on more loans in order to address issues that we did not cause, right? It's also about, as I said, is this funding actually reaching communities, as you're asking? How do we make sure? I think a recent study by the International Institute of Environment and Development had found that only 1 out of every 10 USD is actually reaching and impacting local communities, which, to be honest, should be shocking and should be a cause for alarm for everybody, because most of this money should be reaching local communities, not 1/10. So it's actually like, where is this climate finance going? Is it actually reaching those it needs to? And I think that, of course, we need pressure. That's why civil society is there. That's why we have citizens. If you go to any COP, I'm sure Dr. Nancy can share this, you will see a lot of indigenous communities, and they speak a lot about what's impacting, because they get impacted more than a lot of us. That pressure is needed. It shouldn't be, but it's needed to ensure that this financing is flowing where it needs to. So for me, I think those are the two biggest things that I would say. The money should be grants and not loans, and the money should be reaching and prioritizing the local communities' needs. The people's needs.
That really need them. And I like the fact that, of course, they also get to participate, so that they really share what exactly is happening on the ground. Because they might be sitting in boardrooms and discussing this.
A lot of times people are very removed. You know, somebody is sitting making decisions, not realizing that this is actually a matter of urgency. We have droughts right now. We have, you know, people are losing their livestock, people are losing their lives, people don't have food.
We saw a story, I mean, in Kajiado, like people are selling their you know, cattle and goats for like 100 shillings. 200 shillings, and that is just sad.
I mean, it's a crisis. It's a crisis. In other places, Baringo was brought up, you know, there's classrooms underwater because the lakes have risen so much. And these are things that have to be addressed now, and they have to be addressed in those communities.
As soon as now. All right, and of course, Dr. Nancy, you are already in Sham, and of course, the question will be, so then what is your expectation? I know there's a lot of conversation. There are several thematic areas, which again, we'll be dissecting, you know, right here on NTV. But then the question is, so on an individual level, what are your expectations past COP27? What is it that you hope to see? and that we see it delivered, not just having talks around the theme?
I think there's so many things that we are expecting. The fact that I'm on the gender and climate change, one of the things that I was looking at in COP25, we look at, how do we increase the number of women participation in the COP? And COP26, we say that we don't just want to see the number, we want to see these women participating. And actually they were recording how, when they talk, for example, how long does they talk? When we come to COP27, for example, we want to see that, this increase in the number of women participating in the COP, the number, the participation, but also how does their participation lead to decision making? How does it influence decision making? How are they prepared? And not just seeing maybe like women working on gender and climate change. When I look here, even just the Kenya delegation team, there are women working on, climate change and finance. There are women working on loss and damage. They are kind of well represented. And also coming with the mind that, I've worked with the national government, I've worked at the community level. For example, when I go to Turkana, and I talked to the pastoralists about how climate change is affecting them, they told me that in the past, they used to have droughts after 10 years. Now they have droughts on a yearly basis, and they don't know what they've done to their gods. They've maybe offended their gods, and that's why they are experiencing climate change on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. And when I'm also in Kenya, I'm working with the counties, and I'm so glad that one of the county government, actually the governor called me by herself and asked me, when can I really come at the COP? Is it better I come from the 10th or I come much early? And now I'm telling them, no, you really need to come around 7th, 8th when the presidents are here. And she told me, I'm sending my advanced team. Can you advise them, because COP is so big, so maybe they don't know how to participate. So they're saying the kind of goodwill, and I'm talking to this governor and I'm telling them, okay, fine, now you're making your CIDP, County Investment Development Plan, and this is the third generation. We work on the first CIDP and the second CIDP. And I had this opportunity to view how all the 47 countries in Kenya had mainstream issues of climate change and gender in their CIDPs. And of course, CIDP second, the second one was better than the first one, because the first one was copy and paste. And I was asking this governor, okay, fine, you want to know about climate change, you want how to participate at the COP. But what I want to see as you're developing your CIDP, the third generation, how have you mainstreamed issues of climate change? How have you mainstreamed the issues of gender? And have you also linked them to the budget? Because sometimes you just throw this thing there because we want our CIDP when someone goes and that. And then they told me, in our country also, we want to be part of this financing from the national treasury. How? And one of the discussion is that now they're talking about their counties to pass that climate change bill so that they also get that money. But she's telling me that now we don't know how to deal with the issues of gender and women. How can we ensure that women at the local level are benefiting? Then I tell her, okay, after the COP, I need to have a meeting with you, because when you're going to work with the women and youth, we're going to work with them through the community-based groups. Are they kind of grouped in CBOs? Are they grouped in wherever? And how are we going to do public participation so that this thing comes from the bottom? The community say in this region, as we would like to, for example, do water harvesting. In this region, because maybe we are fisher folks, we want to use improved GECOs. So I can see that link from the community level coming up to the COP. So I think it's a very good opportunity.
Okay, I like that. And of course, Maimuna, for you as well, we're literally being chased out of the studio. But what are some of the sticking points that you are expecting from COP27?
Yeah, thank you. I think Dr. Nancy has touched on some of them.
Most of the things that you're expecting to hear. Okay.
But I think for me, one of the critical things that should come out of this COP is the conversation on loss and damage. So when you talk about loss and damage, and it's a shorthand that we use a lot in the climate space, but really what it means is that there is damage from climate change that has happened that is already irreversible. It can never be addressed, even if we invest how much into adaptation and mitigation now. Yeah. So Dr. Nancy just talked about the community who was having droughts every 10 years, and now it's every year. Yeah. To roll that back is going to be impossible. They've lost their water sources. There's people who, because of rising sea level, maybe the ecosystem has changed. Maybe like for the fisher folk, they're not catching the same fish or the same amount of fish. So how do we address these irreversible damages? And this is because of the historical climate emissions, which started in the 1800s with the Industrial Revolution. And for me, loss and damage is such a critical issue because people don't only need to pay for adaptation and mitigation now, but they need to also pay for what happened in the past. Yes. How do we address those injustices? And loss and damage came up at COP26, but there was not that commitment made to have a financing facility for loss and damage. And of course, there is a lot of trepidation, let me say, from the financiers, because if they accept the concept of loss and damage, then they open themselves up to, for instance, lawsuits from countries like ours or from even individuals. But I think it's very, very important to have this. There's a lot of communities whose lives have been changed and will continue to be changed irreversibly because of climate change. So for me, that's the most critical thing, that we really put loss and damage on the table, and we make sure that there's financing facilities for it, because right now the biggest financiers don't have a way to finance loss and damage, only adaptation and mitigation. So that's what I'm hoping really comes out of COP27.
And of course, we hope that we'll have those conversations after, because again, the developed nations say, you know what, you can actually have that conversation during COP27.
Yes,
so
exactly.
We hope to see.
It would be great, if an African COP could actually have this move accepted, that would be fantastic.
That would be really, really fantastic. Thank you so much, Maimuna. Maimuna Kabatesi, who's a Global Program Manager, Voices for Just Climate Action, as well as Dr. Nancy Omolo, who's already in Sharm el-Sheikh, who is a gender and climate change expert. Of course, Dr. Nancy, again, when you come back, we'd want to continue with this conversation, right? So that we see, so fine, this is what was discussed, and, what moving forward, what does that look like? And of course, given the different thematic areas, as far as adaptation, financing is concerned, and even the presidential roundtable. So we, again, right here at NTV, of course, will be, having these conversations even during COP27 and past. But for now, we have to say goodbye because we're literally being chased out of the studio. Thank you so much, ladies. Such an insightful conversation that we had today. Dr. Nancy, all the very best. Represent. We'll be interacting with you, I'm pretty sure, even during the COP27. But remember what we asked you earlier on, that is, what is your individual contribution towards climate change action? One person very quickly, Dennis6_D6, hey, says, I started chicken farming small scale. The chicken manure is really great for growing bananas, which in turn provide shade for shade all over the compound. In return, the bananas are also cash crops and act as trees to contribute fresh air and attractor of rain. Come see around Kerugoya. Okay, we will come to Kerugoya. But thank you so much for your contribution. We cannot go through all the feedback, but of course the conversation continues online. That is at NTV Kenya, Lubembe_Winnie, and as well as on our website at NTV Kenya. So have a great day ahead, and I will see you on Monday. Tomorrow it's all about Radio Meets TV. So I'll see you on Monday, same time, same place. But conversations around climate change continues. Have yourself a lovely day ahead. See you soon.